Hello, this is Taylor Elwood with Magical Experiments, and joining me this week for an interview is Luxa Strata. I was recently on Luxa's podcast and decided I would return the favor, just because I always think it's interesting to interview people that are working on projects, and because I know there are lots of people out there who are authors and all that other fun stuff, but I think it's good to branch out from that and really interview people doing the work. Not that other authors aren't doing the work, but it's a good thing to do that. We're not doing video this week just because of a couple technical difficulties, but regardless, we're here, and I'm really happy to have you on here. Look, so go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and your magical background, and we'll go from there. And where we can find you on the web.
All right. Hey, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you asking me to be here. I and also to for coming on my show as well. So it's an honor. Okay, so my magical background, I guess I've been messing around with this stuff since I was young, like many of us. There's been periods where I didn't practice and periods where I was really, really into it. And I think that yeah, kind of like having those like ups and downs and like that ebb and flow has been a really interesting thing. Um, in terms of the work that I'm doing right now, I do have a podcast. It's called Lux Occult, Lux Occult podcast. I have a couple other ones too, but in terms of magic, that is the main one. And the thing that I'm really excited about right now is this kind of like collaboration project that I'm involved in called the Green Mushroom Project.
Oh, tell us about that. What is the Green Mushroom Project? What's the focus?
Well, the project started as a way to kind of address some of the problems that seem to be occurring like during the pandemic, especially like the kind of like feelings of like isolation and um well, we were all there. It still continues. It's still difficult, right? But so like kind of thinking about like, well, how can we still stay connected even though we're isolated? And this kind of idea of like, are you familiar with the term vascular arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Sort of playing with that concept of, these two organisms that like have this beneficial symbiotic relationship, these mushrooms and these trees, and kind of thinking about this underground network that kind of supports these forests that you can't really see other than the like little places where the fruiting bodies of the organism sprout up. So kind of playing with that idea and thinking about like, if we're a forest of trees, like what is supporting us under the surface? Um, so we began by creating like a sort of like network of what we're referring to as green aspected magic, just because of the sort of community that it's involved in. We're choosing to sort of like contextualize it in terms of Peter Carroll's colors of magic from Liber Chaos.
Okay.
So the green is like Venusian like friendship kind of shit. So that's where the color comes from. And also, to be honest, like the color green has been shown to have like therapeutic properties as well. Like it does create like a sense of safety and security and stuff in many people. So that's another element of it as well. The project is considered, we're calling it a hypho sigil. Like hypho means web, so it's a sigil that's meant to make a web. And the symbology of the mushroom is kind of cool because it's also a saprotroph. Like it has this connection with death, right? It eats dead things, gross dead things, and turns them into other things. So the idea of like using this energy to kind of dissolve trauma is at play here as well.
Well, it sounds like a really fascinating project, and I particularly can resonate with that because I think we're all feeling the stress of this isolation with the pandemic. I mean, it's interesting that I was reflecting the other day that next month, on the 15th of March, it's going to be basically exactly a year from when I was at work and we were all told, okay, you guys are going to have to work from home now. because of this, because of the coronavirus. And it was interesting to realize that, and to like recognize like, okay, that's when so many other things, so many other social things started to shut down as well, at least here in the US. I mean, it may have been longer in other places, but I think we kind of reacted to it a bit slow. And so having that kind of connection, I think, is really important. Like, how do you maintain that connection, especially when, you're dealing with you're dealing with something which is really superficial, that's the social media in this case, where you have some connection, but it's really not the same depth. So how does this project work? Like, what are you guys specifically doing to connect with each other using the Green Mushroom Project?
Okay. Well, I really like that you brought up social media, because I do think that that's really at play here. I mean, there's been so many studies saying that there's these kind of direct inverse relationships between like happiness and life satisfaction and the amount of time spent using platforms like Facebook or Twitter. And but with this current situation, what real choices do we have in terms of socializing too? So there's a lot of challenges there. Um, Sort of this idea of like injecting like sort of like organicness and like magic and art really into sort of these maybe robotic kind of environments like social media is definitely like an idea here as well. In terms of like what we're doing from a more pragmatic standpoint of like what is actually taking place, we are doing something called Fungal Friday. My friends have a podcast called the Faith Blind Council podcast, and they've got a really cool Discord server where we're kind of organizing all of these efforts. Um, and so every Friday we get together and talk about the project, just kind of shoot the shit, basically, basically just to connect. We talk a lot about animal anatomy and stuff. There's a lot of people involved who are have a background in biology, so there's a lot of jokes about animal genitalia being thrown around. Interesting stuff. And yes, humor is definitely an element to this as well. I did say like, hashtag dick jokes as part of like, selling this to my friends. So
Well, there you go.
um a big part of it though is really centered upon like artistic expression though. We're really encouraging each other to like make art involving the sigil or having to do thematically with the project and like sharing it with each other and really supporting each other in our endeavors that way. Um, and the another part of that too is to encourage people to use magic, and art is such an amazing inroad into that for people. I know we've talked about this a little bit, you and I, and I've heard you discuss it. I mean, your work, there's so much of your work where we talk about this, about just the deep connection between art and magic, and just giving people that opportunity to really give themselves permission to like to get in there,
Yeah. Well, I mean that's the thing. Like, art in and of itself encourages people to express themselves and be creative, and I think it's really important that you have some kind of outlet. It doesn't even have to be like art in the form of painting or sculpture. It could be art in the form of writing or music or whatever, but it should be something that allows you to express something and to basically connect as a result
Mhm.
within yourself, but also with the powers that you work with and with other people.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so I mean, art is an amazing connective experience that we can draw upon and use in our spiritual practices. And a lot of times, people have this rote idea as to what magic looks like, and they don't necessarily think of art as being part of that. But I would argue that art plays a very essential role in magical practice if you're allowed to do it. Anyway, that's my perspective on it, and we're not here to interview me, we're here to interview you. But that's really cool that you're integrating art into into this is there specific mediums of art that you're using, or is it just kind of like a free for all?
People are really encouraged to like interact with the sigil in whatever way feels natural and cool to them. Like it, whether it's media. I've Somebody sent me a picture of a fucking pie that they baked with the sigil on it the other day, and I was really into that. So like, whatever, whatever you're into, really. Like, um, so yeah, and another thing that we're doing too is building this like shared astral space where we can hang out together, which has really been a kind of a fun experiment. Like, you know, speak, getting together and kind of talking about like, well, what do we see here? What do we imagine? Like, as we're going through this kind of like this astral space which contains an astral temple, like what are we all experiencing? And it's really really fascinating how closely our experiences are seeming to line up too. So that's been another like interesting experimental aspect of this. And I do want to mention that like this project, like it's meant to be super accessible. Like it's 100% open to anybody that wants to participate. The only caveat is that you use the magic for what it is intended to be used for, not some other weird bullshit. Just because of like the symbology that's involved and stuff, there's sort of like these built-in countermeasures against that, which is why I'm like saying like, please don't do it. Um, so yeah, I wanted to point that out. If this sounds like something that might be interesting to anybody listening, like please, 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 like you are definitely welcome.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing when you have people try to hijack something, and that's intended for one purpose, and they try to take it over. And the fact that sometimes you have to build in countermeasures to prevent that is unfortunate. But I think it's necessary sometimes. And at the same time, what's interesting to me is like, I mean, this group work is something that I think a lot of magicians don't necessarily think about doing as much. I mean, a lot of the people that I've met over the years, they've tended to be solitary in their practice. I'll admit that, I do some occasional group work, but I've definitely been more solitary in my practice as well. But I think it's a good thing to have a group of people that you can
Mm.
connect with and work with. So if people want to get involved in this, where do they go initially to start accessing um, this work?
Well, right now, I would recommend going to the Faithblind Council podcast Discord server. That's like where we're organizing everything. We're working on getting like websites and more, tools out there for greater accessibility. But everybody's got day jobs too, so it's going along at its own pace. Um, but yeah, I would recommend that. Or please feel free to message me on Instagram at Lux Occult Pod with any questions you might have. I'd be happy to answer them.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, I mean, definitely. And I'll get some of that information from you to put in the show notes too, so
Okay,
people
awesome.
can follow through on that.
I do want to mention one other thing that we're doing is we've begun doing these kind of like group rituals together, like telemagic, sort of like remote magic where we're on video with each other doing these, kind of group workings. We did one on Valentine's Day, which was a healing working. And we found out that the person got out of the hospital a couple days later. So that was really fucking exciting. We're super stoked about that.
No,
So
that's awesome.
yeah, yeah, we're so and so part of this like idea of doing these group workings is to sort of have them have an instructive element to them too. So when people take place in them, they can like learn a little something about, if they're really new to the practice, it'll be something in there, a little lesson in there too. Like this is how you do a knot tying spell. This is how, or whatever. So yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah, that sounds exciting. I mean, I definitely would encourage any of my listeners slash watchers to check it out, because it's always it's good to expand your horizons and learn from different people, and also contribute and share and teach other people. Even someone who's new to a magical practice can actually end up teaching some in their own way, because the questions they ask can get you to think about things in ways you didn't expect. So
I
it's
totally agree.
it's good to contribute to the community that you're part of, and I think this is a great example of that kind of contribution, and something that is refreshing to see, because you don't always see that in the occult communities as much. So it's a really healthy thing to see, actually.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, like coming maybe from a standpoint of like maybe something like Satanism or whatever, like we could say that like it's understood that like you actually do sort of get like a hit of good feel good feelings from uh helping other people, you know. So even looking at it like it I don't know, I have a problem with trying to think of myself as being altruistic, my own philosophical shit aside. But yes, it feels good to help other people. Do it for whatever reason it works for you.
So you're telling me you're not exactly the altruistic type? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that I don't prefer to contextualize myself in that way because I think it leads to problematic blind spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's realistic. You know, there's nothing wrong with admitting that there's an element of self serving, if you will,
Mhm.
that occurs in a thing, even like in group work or whatever else. Like, oh, you know, this makes me feel good, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing it. I think it's perfectly legitimate to own up to that and say it. You know, I think I find it interesting when people, if anything, try to take out that contextual aspect of the self. You know,
Yeah,
it's like, you know, there's nothing wrong with saying, you know, I want to do this to help other people, but let's also be honest here and just admit that there is an element of, you know, I'm getting something out of this. Like when I would go and volunteer at this place called Free Geek in Portland, where, you know, you were recycling electronics. You know, was I helping other people? Sure, but I'll admit I took a lot of pleasure out of just taking computers apart and for a couple hours just not thinking about anything other than the work that I was doing in front of me.
sure, sure. And then
And I
there's
think,
like
oh, go on.
oh, sorry, I was going to say that there's this, you know, idea of like solidarity, not charity too. Like it's like this idea of like we're all doing this too, right? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and so that's another aspect to recognize there. And so it's like with anything, I mean, I think it's all really about how honest you are with yourself about why you're doing what you're doing, whether that's an individual thing that you're doing or group work. You know, and there's no right or wrong answer. Uh, when people get infused with this idea of applying right or wrong, I think that's when you take away from the purity of the work.
Yes, because by what, you know, yardstick are we going to choose to measure those terms? And it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. I'm sure it depends on like what, you know, path you're on or what paradigm you're working in or however you like to talk about the your focus in your work, I guess. But I would say that in general, yeah, definitely. And I feel like there's a little bit, I always feel just a tiny bit suspicious when there's not that recognition that, you know, this is something that we do for ourselves too. I don't know.
Well, I would agree that I feel that kind of suspicion as well. So
I really liked what you said though about being able to learn even from people that are very new.
hmm
There's something, you know, like there's like that Zen concept of like the beginner's mind or whatever too, and like there's definitely something to that. And that's one of the things that I really really enjoy doing is just talking to whatever random practitioners because I fucking really do. I'm so sorry. Is it okay if I swear?
I have no problem with that.
Okay.
I'm not upset.
Okay. Just got myself. I
You had
learned.
already sworn a few times by now,
Oh,
so I mean,
really?
I think that it's kind of a little too late to put the rabbit back into the box for that one, or whatever the saying would go, or the milk back into the bottle. So I think we're good here. Don't worry.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
There's no sensors waiting in the wing, you know, like, oh, looks
I don't want you to get taken off the air. I don't know how this works. But yes, as I was saying, I have learned something from pretty much everybody that I've talked to, right? And it's yeah, it's I do think it's really important, as you said, to get out there and and talk to people that are actually doing things. Like maybe there's a new like twist on the banishing ritual that you like to do that you'll learn from talking to your friend about it or something like that, you know. And my practice had been like very, very solitary until very recently. And so maybe that's why I'm so enthusiastic about this idea. I'm like, people fucking know so much stuff. Like, but um, it is true though. You know, there's no way for everybody to have all of the experiences. Like, everybody that you meet is going to be privy to information that you don't have, right?
Well, there's a saying I like to put out there, and it's challenge what you know by discovering what you can learn, because what you know becomes a form of blinders in its own
Sure.
way. And so, discovering, well, how do you discover what you can learn? Well, there are a number of different ways, but one of the ways that you can discover what you can learn is by talking with other people. And you may not even necessarily practice their particular spiritual path. Like, I have an in-person group. We haven't met for a while, of course, but um, where we would do basically a salon where we would have different people presenting on different things they were working on. And I'll admit, sometimes it was stuff that I wouldn't necessarily have have explored or looked into otherwise. But because somebody was presenting on it, I learned something new, and it gave me a different frame of reference to think about things and explore stuff and possibly to integrate into my practice. So I think when we when people limit themselves, they limit themselves out of uh, out of maybe a sense of, well, I know all this stuff already or whatever else, but there's kind of an arrogance with that comes with it. And when you actually are willing to talk with other people and learn from them and you're humbling yourself in a way. Like, you might know a lot of things and this person might know next to nothing, but they ask a question that gets you to think about things differently. That can be a very humble experience, and that can be a very good experience to have. And something I think that we need to have more of sometimes. Like, it's you don't know all the answers. I mean, I certainly don't know all the answers, and I don't think anybody else out there really does. So it's good to to work in a group or to ask questions or whatever else, and to also entertain new perspectives that may not, maybe this person hasn't practiced magic for a year or 5 years or whatever, and maybe you've practiced for a lot longer, but just because you have that weight of experience doesn't necessarily mean you know everything. And if anything, that weight of experience can be its own limitation.
Yeah, I agree.
So, one of the things you were talking about earlier too, at the very beginning, and I thought I wanted to come back to it, was, about the ebb and flow of magical work. Like, sometimes you go through periods where you're not practicing as much as you could be, and sometimes you're doing like heavy stuff or a lot of stuff. So let's talk about that a little bit. What has been your experience with that ebb and flow, and what do you think about that? Because I think it's not something that's talked about a lot in general. So I'm always curious to hear other people's thoughts on it.
Okay. Well, I have thought about this a little bit. I think that for me, it might have something to do with like thought patterns. I think that there's like a specific frame of mind that goes along with doing regular practical magic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this sort of like, it can be sort of like this balancing act or tightrope walk of, this magical thought versus rationality. You're dealing with these, you know, energies, these strange, states of consciousness, but then you also have to be able to go to the grocery store and buy your groceries, right? Um, so I think that there's a little bit of like subtlety there in terms of the way that thought patterns can influence your perception of the world. I've noticed that for me, the periods of time where I wasn't practicing as regularly were times when I was engaged really heavily in what maybe could be considered like Aristotelian thought, or like doing things like fixing cars or like studying science, or like really kind of heavy like rationality things, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whereas times when I was really pursuing like my artistic side, like with a more of my energy, those were the times when the magic really flowed. And we touched on this before about art and magic, so that totally makes sense. So for me, like a big part of my work has been kind of trying to find that balance. And I think that I'm sort of hoping I'm gonna knock on wood here, but I'm sort of coming to a point in these last couple of years where I think I'm kind of starting to get there. So that's cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I think people can get into magical practice and like get to the point where they're like their heads so far buried into it that they're not able to see anything else. And so I think it's actually good to have some natural ebb and flow
Mhm.
in your magical practice. And there's also the risk of burnout. Like you do stuff, you get so into it that you get to a point where you end up burning out instead of knowing when to relax and take a break. I mean, certainly something that I think this year has certainly brought that up for me in intimate details. It's kind of forced me to recognize when I need to take a break,
Mhm.
when I need to, let myself off the hook and say, okay, it's okay if today I didn't do the daily ritual or I didn't do my qigong today or whatever else. Instead of being like, oh, I should have done that. Well, when it gets to the point where it becomes a chore, are you really fully engaged in it anyway?
Yeah,
Is it something that's really bringing you joy and purpose? And of course, you're also gonna have times where things are need to be where maybe you're not seeing results and where things are a little stagnant. And I think that's okay too, because we sometimes need to have those times where things don't seem to be working, and then we realize, well, really what was happening is we were seeding the ground and
sure.
we were making ourselves fallow for the realizations that were going to come about as a result of doing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Or we were making space for the new thing. Like, sometimes when things feel stagnant, it's a signal to me that it's time to look for some new element to introduce or pursue some new line of inquiry. So yeah, it's an opportunity. I totally agree.
So you were doing some other group work as well. And when we were talking, when we did the podcast, you're telling me a little bit about that. I know you're not doing it now, but can you talk a little bit about it and tell us a little bit about what you were doing?
Yeah, sure. I was participating in a project called Ankh, which is from the Church of Nothing. Nia Ain and Ninoff are the ones that developed this. It's a really cool. I would say it's well, okay. So Ankh ANQ is it stands for like Ankh is not Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a system of correspondence which is like Kabbalah in that there are paths and spheres, but there's some really interesting differences between Ankh and what we would consider to be like Kabbalah and kind of classic Western occultism. So it instead of having 10 spheres, there's 12 and 36 paths.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most interesting things I think about it, though, is that instead of it being like this fixed tree, it's an emergent tree that kind of like grows and builds. So it's this kind of like idea of contextualizing the story of creation in a completely non-dogmatic way. Just really, um, I guess you could say like scientific-esque, although I'm not sure if that's the proper qualifier, but looking at things without there necessarily needing to be like a creator deity. How would things emerge on their own from chaos? And so it's yeah, the idea of this emergent tree I thought was really cool. There's all kinds of other very interesting things about it. Could probably go on and on. I would encourage people to check out the Church of Nothing blog at COVN on Tumblr, and you can check out the cool pictures and everything there. What we were mostly focusing on is kind of investigating these paths and feeling out like what they should be named. Like, do the regular tarot correspondences kind of fit? Plus some additions, obviously, since there's more paths. But um, and also like kind of investigating like, well, what are these spheres, like what are they like? We've got the sphere of, say, agency or agent. Like what is the temple of agency like? Like what is the temple of thought like? We found a library. So like very cool things. And yeah, so as I said, I would check out the COVN blog and take a look at that.
And are you working on any individual projects right now that you feel like sharing? I mean, you
Um,
don't have to if you don't want to.
I'm working on a couple of individual projects. I'm doing some work with like audio um magic and ego magic. Um, so yeah, it's kind of this idea of sort of like investigating the different sort of aspects of the self. And the way that I've been doing that is like I've recorded myself doing a sort of like daily like solo sex magic ritual, and then I've been recording the trance state that results afterwards and like what I say and everything, and mixing that with music to sort of illustrate these different like aspects of the personality that can be discovered by doing this type of work. It's very navel gazy, but it's enjoyable.
Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a bit of navel gazing. I mean, we all do it. So let's just, you know.
I just want to own that it's very navel gazy, but it's very fun. So
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it does like there's no real. I mean, that's the thing I think that's interesting to me about magical practices in general is like, we have this results focus in a lot of magic, but then there is something to be said for doing some of that navel gazing work as well, doing that internal work and things like that, and finding a balance between the two.
yeah, totally. And I'm not sure that I would be able to like understand where I really want to go in like a big picture way without doing that work first. Like, the pragmatic magic, that's great. But like, if you don't know where you want to go, you're just kind of spinning your wheels, I guess. I don't know.
Well, yeah, that's what I would call reactive magic, where basically at that point you're just reacting to whatever's happening around you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're reacting to whatever's happening around you, then you're never really taking charge. You don't know where
Yeah,
you want to go. Instead, it's, oh, this problem cropped up, and now I've got to resolve it, and I'm going to use magic to do that. And a lot of times, what I've noticed anyway is that your own is that the problems that crop up in your life, even when you fix them with magic, they end up coming back if you haven't really done the work, because there's one thing those problems have all in common, and it's you.
totally. And I think you talk about this in Magical Identity, right? I'm pretty sure. And yeah, this kind of idea of like looking at things from a systemic way, it just makes sense.
It does. So, I mean, I think that that systemic awareness is something that's a good thing to apply, and however you end up doing that, whether you're doing it the way that you're doing it, or through meditation or through some other kind of practice, it can really be liberating for you, because it helps you start to recognize all the different ways you might be sabotaging yourself, as well as answering those questions of, well, what do I want to do? Why am I here? And all those other, navel gazy things that need to be done on occasion to get you where you're going.
Definitely. I guess let's see what other projects am I doing? I like to keep myself busy. So yeah, there's several like smaller ones, but I guess I'm also experimenting a lot with food magic in the last year or so, and that's been really fun. I really like the idea of like, these primal drives like food or sex or, other things, like incorporating that in there, because that's such a powerful um it's such a psychologically powerful thing to us.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. It's interesting, like when you cook your own food, for example, and you're making that food, how that can, like, in and of itself, be just a very primal thing, because of course you need to feed yourself and you're trying to take care of yourself. And like when you cook with somebody else, even, it's a very intimate activity in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bonding thing in its own right, and I think that can be really useful to explore. So or like other primal drives, as you said, I mean, those primal drives are things that are part of us, and so it can be something that actually helps us to become more in tune with ourselves and what we really want.
Definitely.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on here today. I've really enjoyed chatting with you further and getting to know you a bit better, and learning about your projects. And in the show notes, we'll get some of that information that you had shared in regards to the projects that you're working on. And any last thoughts you want to share with us before we wrap this up?
Um, no, I just want to say that I really appreciate you asking me on, and I enjoyed our conversation very much. And I've enjoyed, your work, and I really do like your philosophy. It meshes very well with my own, so I appreciate you putting it out there. And yes, I hope to speak to you further in the future.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.